In this little lecture, this video lecture, I will go over the elements of perception checking and then talk about the perception checking assessment for interpersonal communication. Very quickly, the elements involved in perception checking include a description of the other person's behavior, at least two possible interpretations for that behavior, and a request for clarification. Here's an example between Jeff and Joseph. Jeff said, "When you stomped out of the room and slammed the door, I wasn't sure whether you were mad at me or just in a hurry. How did you feel?" Joseph responded, "I'm sorry, I forgot that I had to make an important phone call at 3 o'clock. Notice how in this example, Joseph's behavior is labeled in parentheses, as are the two interpretations and the request for clarification in Jeff's statement. Also notice when Jeff mentions his two interpretations, that sentence ends in a period, not in a question mark, not with a question mark. So you want to have a declarative statement. You don't want to end that sentence with a question mark. You don't want to ask a question, you want to make a statement that ends in a period. Okay. For the assessment, the perception checking assessment, make sure the written portion is typed and single spaced. If you want to double space it, that's okay, but do make sure it's typed or I won't accept it. Alright, you're going to describe the situation for two different relationships. The first one will be a personal relationship, which is a relationship between you and another family member or a significant other, or between you and a friend. The second one will be a professional relationship, or a relationship between you and a coworker, you and a manager, you and someone else at work, or between you and someone at school, such as between you and another classmate or you and an instructor. For each of these two situations, both personal and professional, describe your interpersonal goal and the reason or reasons why you think perception checking can help you to meet that goal. For each of these two situations, develop and label a complete perception checking statement. Again, you can go back and look at Chapter 3 for some samples if you need some assistance in looking at some good examples. Remember to write your dialogue in first person as if you were actually speaking to that individual. Each perception checking statement should include, once again, the other person's behavior, at least two possible interpretations for that behavior, and an open-ended request for clarification. Be sure to label each part in parentheses, kind of like we saw in the sample earlier. Please refer to page 2 in the written instructions for this assessment to learn more about how the demonstration part of this assessment will be graded, or what components will be reviewed or evaluated. So on page 2 of the instructions for this assessment, there's a checklist, and in that checklist you'll see the different components that will be assessed. When you turn in your paperwork, your typed paperwork, when you come to class, be sure that that you completed all portions of the written assessment, including the description, an explanation of the goal or goals, interpersonal goals, and the reasoning for that interpersonal goals, and then of course include the full perception check. Full credit will only be given if everything is included correctly and labeled properly. So let's take a quick look here at the format. So when you type out your written portion, start with personal relationship at the top and label it personal relationship. Under that, you'll type number 1 and then describe the situation in detail, such as, "My brother Bill and I were watching TV. He suddenly got up off the sofa and left the room without saying anything." That could be one example. And then you go down to number 2, letter A. State what your interpersonal goal is. So you could say, "My interpersonal goal in using perception checking in this instance is," and then complete that sentence. And then letter 2, letter B, state why perception checking can help you meet that goal. So you can say, "Perception checking can help me meet this interpersonal goal by," and then complete that sentence. Then in number 3, you'll actually type out the dialogue between you and the other person, in which you are doing a perception check of the other person's behavior, or you're doing a perception check of the other person, focusing on his or her behavior. So that would be very similar to the sample we saw before between Jeff and Joseph. So first you would label your name, type out your name, and then type out your dialogue in quotation marks, and then label each part of the perception check in parentheses, such as behavior, the two interpretations, and a request for clarification. Once again, be sure that sentence or sentences in which you include the two interpretations, make sure that sentence ends in a period, not in a question mark. You want to make a declarative sentence. You don't want to ask a question. Although they may sound similar, they do come across differently when speaking to the other person. Also important, it is important to remember not to include the sample provided here between Jeff and Joseph, or one that's very similar to that, or to provide a sample that's very similar to the ones found in Chapter 3. Come up with your own original, unique scenarios for doing a perception check. Don't just copy something out of the textbook or copy the sample used here in this video lecture. Come up with something that's rather different, somewhat original and creative. It doesn't have to be so creative, but it has to be original. And lastly, remember, it's your responsibility to make sure that you understand the components involved in perception checking and that you've properly included them in the written portion of this assessment. Hopefully this lecture has provided some clarification on what you need to do for this assessment in case you missed class or in case the instructions in class weren't quite clear or weren't clear for you. And hopefully you turn the paper in and do a really good job on the demonstration and get a real good score on this assessment. Good luck, and we'll see you in class.